July 4, 1945. The sun hadn't yet broken over the Pennsylvania hills when Sergeant Dorothy Brennan unlocked the heavy wooden doors of the women's dormitory at Camp Reynolds, a prisoner of war facility tucked into the Allegheny foothills outside Pittsburgh. Inside, 247 Italian women stirred from sleep, most still disoriented by their circumstances. They had arrived as prisoners after Italy's surrender, many captured while serving in auxiliary units or working in military support roles across North Africa and Sicily. What they were about to witness would shatter every assumption they held about American weakness, decadence, and inevitable collapse. Corporal Maria Rossetti pulled her thin blanket closer as the morning bell rang. She had grown up in a small village outside Florence, where her father worked as a metalsmith and her mother raised 6 children on rationed bread and watered-down soup. Before the war, Maria had believed Mussolini's promises that Italy would reclaim the glory of Rome, that fascist discipline would forge a new empire from the chaos of liberal democracy. She had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1942, convinced that sacrifice for the state represented the highest human purpose. Now she sat on a narrow cot in rural Pennsylvania, about to celebrate a holiday she had been taught to despise. American Independence Day. The supposed birthday of a mongrel nation built on individualism and greed, destined to crumble under its own contradictions. That's what the newsreels had shown in Italian cinemas. That's what her commanding officers had repeated until it became truth. The dormitory windows faced east toward the town of Millville, population 4,800, a modest collection of homes and businesses that served the surrounding farming communities. As dawn light filtered through the glass, Rossetti noticed something unusual. Flags. Dozens of them. American flags hung from porches, draped across storefronts, mounted on poles in front gardens. Red, white, and blue bunting decorated every visible surface. The entire town had transformed overnight into a celebration she couldn't yet comprehend. Sergeant Brennan's voice cut through the morning murmurs. "Ladies, today is Independence Day in America. You'll be joining the townspeople for the celebration. This is not optional. You will behave with dignity, you will respect the local customs, and you will remember that you represent your country even in captivity." Rossetti exchanged glances with her bunkmate, Lucia Moretti, a former postal worker from Milan who had been captured in Tunisia. Moretti's expression mirrored her own confusion. They had been told Americans were too soft for real celebration, too divided by class and race to unite around shared values. The flags suggested otherwise. At 8 o'clock, the prisoners formed orderly lines and marched under guard down the gravel road toward Millville. The morning air smelled of fresh-cut grass and something else, something sweet and unfamiliar. As they approached the town square, Rossetti saw the source. Long tables stretched across the entire central plaza, covered in white cloth and laden with food. Not military rations. Not survival portions. Real food in quantities that made her stop walking until the guard behind her gently urged her forward. There were platters of fried chicken, golden and glistening. Bowls of potato salad larger than anything she had seen outside a military commissary. Fresh corn on the cob stacked in pyramids. Pies, dozens of pies, their crusts perfectly browned, filled with cherries, apples, and berries. Pitchers of lemonade sat sweating in the summer heat beside glass dispensers of iced tea. Watermelons, split open to reveal bright red flesh, waited on beds of ice. This was wartime. This was 1945. European cities lay in ruins, populations starved, and here sat enough food to feed her entire village for a month, displayed casually on tables in a town square for a single day's celebration. Lucia grabbed Rossetti's arm, her fingers trembling. This cannot be real. It must be staged, for propaganda purposes. But the children running between the tables were too genuine, their laughter too unself-conscious. The elderly women arranging platters moved with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to abundance, not the careful rationing of scarcity. Local families arrived carrying additional dishes, adding to the already overwhelming spread. One woman, perhaps 70 years old, placed a massive bowl of fresh strawberries on a table already groaning under the weight of food. "Before we jump back in, Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mayor Thomas Whitfield stood on a raised platform at the center of the square, his voice amplified through speakers that seemed impossibly clear compared to the crackling radios Rossetti remembered from Italy. Welcome, neighbors, friends, and guests. Today we celebrate the birth of our nation, the day we declared that all people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We gather in gratitude for the freedoms we enjoy and in hope for the day when all the world knows such blessings. The Italian women stood in a designated area, watched by guards who seemed more interested in the food than in preventing escape. Rossetti scanned the crowd, counting heads. Over 2,000 people had gathered in this small town, more than she expected the entire population to support. Where had they come from? The surrounding farms? Neighboring communities? A young American girl, perhaps 8 years old, approached the prisoners' section carrying a plate of cookies. Her mother followed close behind, her expression cautious but not hostile. The girl stopped at the rope barrier separating prisoners from civilians and held out the plate. "Would you like some?" she asked in clear English that Rossetti's limited vocabulary could barely parse. One of the guards, a kind-faced corporal named Hayes, translated. "She's offering you cookies." Her mother made them. Rossetti reached out slowly, taking a single cookie. It was still warm, studded with chocolate chips that must have cost precious ration points. The girl smiled and moved down the line, offering cookies to each prisoner until her plate was empty. Her mother watched with an expression Rossetti couldn't quite read. Not pity. Not superiority. Something closer to simple neighborliness, as if offering cookies to enemy prisoners was perfectly ordinary behavior. The cookie dissolved on Rossetti's tongue, sweet and rich in a way she hadn't tasted since before the war. Real butter. Real sugar. Real chocolate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ingredients alone represented wealth beyond what most Italian families could afford even in peacetime. And this child was distributing them freely to prisoners, to enemies, without hesitation or ceremony. Lieutenant Sophia Marchetti stood beside Rossetti, her military bearings still evident despite months of captivity. Marchetti had commanded a signals unit in North Africa, managing communications equipment with the precision that had made her a rising star in the Italian auxiliary services. She had believed in the fascist message of efficiency, of state power achieving what individual chaos could never accomplish. "This is propaganda," Marchetti whispered, her voice tight with certainty that seemed increasingly desperate. "They are showing us surplus to demoralize us. To make us doubt." But Rossetti wasn't so sure anymore. She had watched American supply lines during her capture in Sicily. She had seen the endless convoys of trucks, the abundance of equipment, the casual way American soldiers discarded materials that Italian units would have treasured. This felt less like propaganda and more like simply another Tuesday for people accustomed to plenty. At 9 o'clock, the parade began. A high school marching band appeared at the far end of Main Street, instruments gleaming in the morning sun. They played the Stars and Stripes Forever with enthusiasm that overcame occasional technical imperfections. Behind them came the color guard, young men in crisp uniforms carrying flags that snapped in the breeze. Then came the veterans, older men who had served in the Great War, walking with pride despite their years. What struck Rossetti most was the diversity of participants. Factory workers marched alongside business owners. Farm families waved from decorated trucks. The local African-American community had its own contingent, dressed in Sunday finest, carrying a banner that read "Freedom for All." In fascist theory, such mixing of classes and races would create chaos and resentment. Here it seemed to function without apparent tension. A float carrying schoolchildren passed by, the kids dressed in colonial costumes, waving small flags. Another featured local Girl Scouts distributing miniature American flags to the crowd. A fire truck, polished until its red paint gleamed like a mirror, drove slowly past with firefighters throwing candy to children who shrieked with delight. Lucia pressed close to Rossetti. How can they afford this? The gasoline alone for these vehicles, the decorations, the costumes. We were told American economy was collapsing, that their war effort had bankrupted them. Rossetti had no answer. The evidence before her contradicted years of careful indoctrination. These people didn't look bankrupt. They looked prosperous, confident, united in celebration despite the ongoing war in the Pacific. The gap between what she had been taught and what she was witnessing grew wider with each passing moment. The parade continued for nearly 2 hours. Scout troops, church groups, fraternal organizations, school bands, military units, and civic associations all had their moment in the procession. The sheer organizational capacity required to coordinate such an event boggled Rossetti's mind. In Italy, such parades happened only under direct government mandate, with careful control of every participant and message. This seemed organic, volunteer-driven, emerging from genuine community desire rather than state compulsion. When the parade ended, Mayor Whitfield returned to his platform. Before we enjoy our community meal, I'd like to recognize some special guests. Among us today are women from Italy, currently held at Camp Reynolds. They come from a nation with rich history and culture, and those circumstances have made them our prisoners. We remember that they are human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Today, on our Independence Day, we invite them to share our meal and witness what freedom looks like in practice. The crowd applauded. Not mockingly. Not reluctantly. But with genuine warmth that made Rossetti's eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. She had been prepared for hatred, for gloating, for the cruelty that victors often showed the vanquished. Instead, she received an invitation to join a celebration of the very values she had been trained to despise. Guards escorted the Italian women to the serving tables. Local women, members of something called the Ladies' Auxiliary, filled plates with astonishing generosity. A heaping portion of chicken, 2 ears of corn, generous scoops of potato salad and coleslaw, sliced tomatoes so ripe they stained the plate red, a thick slice of fresh bread with butter, and a piece of cherry pie that would have served 4 people in her village back home. Rossetti carried her plate to a shaded area where prisoners were directed to sit. She stared at the food, calculating its caloric value, its cost, its sheer abundance. This single meal contained more protein, fat, and fresh vegetables than she had consumed in an entire week during her final months in Italy. And this was casual community celebration food, not special rations or propaganda display. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, fighting the urge to consume everything immediately in case it was her only opportunity. Around her, other Italian women did the same, their faces reflecting wonder, confusion, and the beginning of doubt about everything they had believed. A local woman approached their area, an older lady with gray hair and a warm smile. She carried a pitcher of lemonade and refilled cups without being asked. "You girls need anything else? There's plenty more food. Don't be shy now." Corporal Hayes translated, and several women held out their cups for refills. The woman obliged, chatting pleasantly about the weather and the quality of this year's strawberry crop as if serving enemy prisoners was perfectly normal behavior. After she left, Lieutenant Marchetti leaned close to Rossetti. "They are trying to corrupt us with luxury, to make us forget our principles." But Rossetti wasn't sure anymore what principles remained worth remembering. The fascist promises of strength through unity rang hollow when confronted with American abundance achieved through individual liberty. The warnings about capitalist collapse seemed absurd when watching prosperous communities celebrate with genuine joy. The certainty that Italian discipline would triumph over American chaos evaporated in the face of organizational capacity that exceeded anything she had seen in her own military service. At noon, the fireworks began. Rossetti had expected a modest display, perhaps a few rockets to mark the occasion. What she witnessed instead defied her understanding of wartime resource management. The first shell screamed into the sky with a whistle that made several prisoners flinch instinctively. It exploded in a massive burst of red stars that filled the summer sky, each point of light trailing sparks as it fell. Before those faded, 3 more shells launched simultaneously, creating overlapping patterns of gold, white, and blue. The explosions echoed off the surrounding hills, a thunderous celebration of excess that would have been unthinkable in resource-starved Italy. Shell after shell climbed into the afternoon sky. Chrysanthemums of green fire. Willows of silver rain. Crossettes that split and split again into dozens of individual bursts. Palm trees that hung suspended before dropping slowly earthward. The bombardment of beauty continued without pause, a demonstration of wealth so extreme it bordered on incomprehensible. Rossetti tried to calculate the cost. Each shell required precision manufacturing, explosive materials, and metal casings. The chemicals alone for such colorful displays must have consumed resources that could have produced ammunition or industrial materials. Yet here Americans were, literally burning money in the sky for entertainment while simultaneously fighting a war across the Pacific. The grand finale arrived at 12:20. 50 shells launched within seconds of each other, filling the entire visible sky with explosions that overlapped until individual bursts became indistinguishable from the general conflagration of light and sound. Red, white, and blue dominated, creating a shimmering aerial flag that hung suspended for a breathtaking moment before dissolving into smoke and falling stars. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Children squealed with delight. Adults whistled and shouted. The Italian prisoners sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. Lucia grabbed Rossetti's hand, squeezing hard enough to hurt. "We never had a chance, did we? We never even understood what we were fighting." The observation hit Rossetti like a physical blow because she recognized its truth. Italy had gone to war believing American democracy made them weak, that their diversity created fatal divisions, that their materialism had softened them beyond effective resistance. The reality was precisely opposite. American prosperity enabled celebrations that would bankrupt entire Italian provinces. Their organizational capacity coordinated community events more complex than Italian military operations. Their unity transcended the divisions that fascist ideology insisted would destroy them. As the smoke from the fireworks drifted away on the afternoon breeze, Rossetti felt something fundamental shift inside her. The certainty that had sustained her through training, deployment, and capture began to crumble. She had believed lies. Not small lies or minor exaggerations, but fundamental falsehoods about the nature of freedom, prosperity, and human potential. The afternoon continued with games, contests, and entertainment. Three-legged races for children. A pie-eating contest that drew roars of laughter from spectators. A baseball game between local teams that demonstrated sporting enthusiasm that needed no translation. Musicians set up on the platform and played everything from patriotic marches to popular jazz tunes, the music flowing freely without apparent concern for maintaining proper dignity or state-approved messaging. As evening approached, families began packing up, carrying home their empty dishes and tired children. The Italian prisoners were formed into lines for the march back to Camp Reynolds. Before they departed, Mayor Whitfield approached with Sergeant Brennan. "I hope you ladies enjoyed the celebration," he said through Brennan's translation. "I know these are difficult circumstances for everyone. But I wanted you to see that America fights for principles, not just territory. We believe all people deserve freedom and opportunity. That includes you, even now." Rossetti wanted to respond, to say something that captured the confusion and revelation she felt. But the words wouldn't form properly. Instead, she simply nodded, hoping he understood that something significant had shifted, even if she couldn't yet articulate exactly what. The walk back to camp felt longer than the morning journey. Rossetti's mind churned with images, calculations, and impossible comparisons. The food alone would have fed her village's entire 4th of July celebration for weeks. The fireworks display exceeded anything she had seen in major Italian cities even before the war. The casual abundance, the genuine celebration, the organizational sophistication all pointed to capabilities she had been assured didn't exist. That night, lying on her cot in the darkened dormitory, Rossetti heard whispered conversations throughout the room. Other women processing the same revelations, questioning the same assumptions, confronting the same uncomfortable truths. Lieutenant Marchetti maintained her insistence that everything had been staged propaganda, but her voice carried less conviction than before. Too many details had been too authentic. Too much abundance had been too casual. Too much joy had been too genuine. Corporal Elena Valenti, who had served in a quartermaster unit in Sicily, spoke into the darkness. I managed supply logistics for 300 soldiers. The organizational complexity of feeding them, clothing them, maintaining their equipment consumed my every waking hour. Today I watched a town of 5,000 people coordinate a celebration more complex than military operations I helped plan, and they did it with volunteers and community donations. How is that possible if democracy creates chaos and inefficiency? No one had a good answer. The question hung in the air like the smoke from the afternoon's fireworks, visible evidence of something that challenged everything they thought they knew. Rossetti closed her eyes, but sleep remained elusive. Her mind kept returning to the young girl with the cookies, offering them with a smile that held no hatred or superiority. To the elderly woman pouring lemonade, treating prisoners with simple human kindness. To Mayor Whitfield's words about principles and universal human dignity. To the impossible abundance of food, the shocking excess of fireworks, the genuine unity of celebration. She had come to America as a prisoner, convinced of her captor's weakness and inevitable decline. After one day, one celebration, one glimpse of what American freedom actually looked like in practice, those convictions lay shattered. The propaganda she had consumed for years suddenly felt transparent, obviously false in light of direct experience. What troubled her most was the implications. If Americans could achieve such abundance, such organization, such genuine community unity through individual freedom and democratic principles, what did that say about the fascist promises she had believed? What did it say about the war Italy had chosen to fight? What did it say about the future she had imagined under Mussolini's new Roman Empire? The questions multiplied faster than answers could form. As midnight approached and the dormitory finally quieted, Rossetti made a decision. She would observe everything. She would question everything. She would test her beliefs against reality rather than clinging to comfortable lies. Whatever truth emerged from that process, no matter how uncomfortable, would be better than the false certainty that had led her to this cot in this prison camp in this country she had fundamentally misunderstood. Outside, a few late fireworks still popped in the distance, families with their own small celebrations extending the holiday into the night. Each distant explosion reminded Rossetti of American abundance, American confidence, American power that operated on scales she was only beginning to comprehend. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new evidence, new challenges to old assumptions. But tonight, she lay in darkness, feeling the foundations of her worldview crack and shift, wondering what would remain when the process completed itself. The revelation at Millville's Independence Day celebration was not an isolated experience confined to Camp Reynolds. Across 17 facilities housing Italian women prisoners scattered throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and upstate New York, similar awakenings occurred during that same 4th of July week in 1945. Nearly 800 Italian women, captured during various stages of the Mediterranean campaign, simultaneously encountered American civilian life in ways that contradicted every assumption fascist education had instilled. At Camp Waterford outside Erie, Pennsylvania, Sergeant Gabriella Costa watched local churches organize a community picnic that fed over 3,000 people without government coordination or military oversight. Costa had served as an administrative officer in the Italian Women's Auxiliary Fascist Corps, managing logistics for units across southern Italy. She understood organizational hierarchies, command structures, and the necessity of centralized control for any complex operation. What she witnessed in Erie defied that understanding completely. 5 different churches, representing Protestant denominations she couldn't distinguish, plus 1 Catholic parish, had coordinated food preparation, table arrangements, entertainment schedules, and cleanup operations through nothing more than volunteer committees and telephone calls. No government official directed the effort. No military authority enforced compliance. No fascist party representative ensured ideological purity. Yet the event functioned with precision that exceeded military operations Costa had personally supervised. Each church brought specific dishes, avoiding duplication through simple communication. Families volunteered for setup, serving, and cleanup shifts that rotated smoothly throughout the day. When rain threatened at 2 o'clock, the entire gathering relocated to a covered pavilion in 15 minutes through spontaneous cooperation that required no central command. Costa documented her observations in a letter to her sister Francesca back in Naples, writing carefully to avoid military censors while conveying the profound dissonance she felt. She described the abundance, the organization, the genuine community spirit that emerged without coercion or state direction. She mentioned the children playing freely across racial and class lines, the elderly respected regardless of wealth, the casual mixing of factory workers and business owners at shared tables. What she couldn't adequately convey was the psychological impact of watching voluntary cooperation achieve results that fascist theory insisted required authoritarian control. The church picnic shouldn't have worked according to everything she had learned about human nature, social organization, and the necessity of strong leadership. But it worked beautifully, efficiently, joyfully in ways that made her previous certainties feel increasingly hollow. Lieutenant Angela Ricci experienced her awakening at Camp Elmira in New York, where local American Legion posts organized a joint Independence Day ceremony honoring both American servicemen and acknowledging the common humanity of the Italian prisoners. Ricci had commanded a signals intelligence unit, intercepting Allied communications and analyzing enemy capabilities. She considered herself analytically rigorous, resistant to emotional manipulation or propaganda. The ceremony challenged that self-assessment. A local veteran, a man named Robert Sullivan who had fought in the Great War, gave a speech that acknowledged the tragedy of conflict while celebrating the principles America fought to defend. He spoke of liberty, individual dignity, and the universal human desire for self-determination. Then he did something that made Ricci's breath catch in her throat. He invited Italian prisoners to place flowers at the base of the town's war memorial alongside American Gold Star mothers who had lost sons in the current conflict. The gesture carried symbolic weight that transcended language barriers. These American women, grieving their dead children, stood beside enemy prisoners and shared acknowledgement of war's human cost. No one demanded apologies. No one assigned blame. The ceremony simply recognized common humanity beneath the uniforms and flags. Ricci placed her carnation with trembling hands, standing beside a woman named Margaret Chin whose son had died at Anzio, possibly killed by Italian artillery. Mrs. Chin nodded to her, eyes wet but expression open, and Ricci felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of American values. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't the decadent sentimentality fascist propaganda had described. This was strength of a kind she hadn't previously recognized, the moral courage to see humanity in enemies and extend dignity even amid grief. The statistical evidence of American capacity became impossible to ignore as prisoners gained broader exposure to civilian life. At Camp Conneaut in Ohio, women working in local canneries observed food processing operations that exceeded Italian industrial capabilities by margins that defied propaganda explanations. The H.J. Heinz plant near their camp processed tomatoes at rates approaching 400 tons daily during peak harvest season. Corporal Beatrice Mancini, who had studied agricultural economics before the war, calculated that this single American factory processed more tomatoes in 1 week than her entire home province of Campania had commercially canned in the best pre-war year. The machinery itself represented technological sophistication Mancini associated with advanced manufacturing, not food processing. Automated washing systems, mechanical sorters, steam peelers, and precision filling equipment operated with assembly line efficiency that minimized waste while maximizing output. The factory employed 300 workers, predominantly women, who earned wages exceeding what Italian factory supervisors received for similar work. Mancini requested permission to study the operation more closely, surprising camp administrators with her genuine intellectual curiosity. Over subsequent weeks, she learned that American food processing had achieved industrial scales through systematic mechanization dating back decades. Companies like Heinz, Campbell's, and Del Monte had invested in technology that made mass production economically viable while maintaining quality standards that exceeded hand-processed goods. The economic implications troubled Mancini's understanding of capitalist systems. fascist theory taught that private ownership inevitably led to exploitation, corner-cutting, and eventual collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Yet here stood factories privately owned, operating profitably, paying decent wages, producing quality goods at scales that state-controlled Italian industries could never match. She documented machinery specifications, production rates, worker compensation, and quality control procedures in detailed notebooks that camp officials monitored but didn't confiscate. Her engineering analysis concluded that American food processing alone possessed industrial capacity exceeding Italy's entire manufacturing sector across all categories combined. One American cannery matched the output of entire Italian regions. The automotive industry provided even more shocking revelations. At Camp Youngstown, prisoners working in factory cafeterias witnessed shift changes at General Motors plants that employed over 15,000 workers producing military vehicles, engines, and components. The scale of operations, the mechanization of production, the coordination of supply chains that delivered raw materials from across the continent made Italian manufacturing seem almost medieval by comparison. Private Rosa Santoro, who had worked in a Fiat plant before military service, observed American automotive assembly lines with professional comprehension that made the technological gap painfully clear. The mechanical sophistication, the precision tooling, the systematic approach to quality control exceeded anything she had seen in Italian factories that were considered advanced by European standards. What struck Santoro most forcefully was the casual nature of American industrial superiority. These weren't showcase facilities designed to impress visitors. These were ordinary factories in medium-sized cities, operating without fanfare or propaganda, simply producing vehicles at rates that exceeded Fiat's total annual output before the war. And Youngstown represented just one industrial city among hundreds across American manufacturing regions. The civilian prosperity visible in surrounding neighborhoods reinforced the evidence of systematic abundance. Workers leaving these factories drove personal automobiles to homes with electric lighting, indoor plumbing, and appliances that Italian middle-class families could rarely afford. The standard of living for American factory workers exceeded what Italian professionals enjoyed in major cities. Santoro wrote to her husband, also a Fiat employee, describing what she observed with technical precision that she hoped would survive military censorship. She detailed production rates, quality metrics, worker compensation, and technological capabilities with the analytical distance of an industrial engineer rather than the emotion of a disillusioned prisoner. But emotion crept into her final paragraph despite professional restraint. She admitted questioning whether Italy had ever possessed the industrial foundation necessary to sustain prolonged modern warfare. She confessed doubts about fascist economic claims that now seemed obviously false in light of American manufacturing reality. She wondered aloud whether their entire generation had been sacrificed pursuing impossible ambitions based on systematic lies about comparative capabilities. The agricultural sector provided additional evidence that American abundance resulted from systematic advantages rather than temporary wartime conditions or propaganda exaggeration. At Camp Millville, prisoners working on surrounding farms encountered mechanization levels that made Italian agricultural practices seem centuries obsolete. Sergeant Julia Esposito, whose family owned a small farm near Salerno, watched American farmers operate equipment she had never imagined existed. Mechanical corn pickers harvested entire fields in hours. Hay balers processed tonnage that would have required weeks of hand labor back home. Tractors pulled multiple implements simultaneously, preparing soil, planting seeds, and applying fertilizer in single passes. The productivity statistics were devastating to anyone familiar with Italian agricultural realities. A single American farmer working 400 acres with proper machinery produced more grain annually than Esposito's entire village generated across all family plots combined. The mechanization, the scientific farming methods, the infrastructure supporting agricultural distribution exceeded anything Italian farming had achieved even before war disrupted normal production. What troubled Esposito most was the individual ownership structure. These weren't state farms or collective operations. These were private family farms, often passed down through generations, operated by individuals who made independent decisions about crops, methods, and markets. The prosperity they achieved contradicted fascist teachings that only centralized state control could optimize agricultural production. She observed farmers consulting scientific publications, attending agricultural extension meetings, adopting new seed varieties, and implementing soil conservation practices through voluntary education programs rather than government mandates. The systematic improvement resulted from individual initiative incentivized by profit rather than ideological compliance enforced by authority. By late summer of 1945, Italian prisoners working across civilian sectors possessed detailed knowledge of American productive capacity that painted an inescapable picture of systematic superiority across every economic category. The evidence accumulated daily through direct observation rather than propaganda or hearsay. American manufacturing exceeded Italian industrial output by factors approaching 10 to 1 across comparable sectors. Agricultural productivity per worker surpassed Italian levels by margins exceeding 500%. Food processing, transportation networks, electrical generation, and civilian infrastructure all demonstrated technological advancement and organizational sophistication that made Italian capabilities seem primitive by comparison. The psychological impact of these revelations varied among prisoners based on their previous convictions and personal circumstances. Some, like Lieutenant Marchetti at Camp Reynolds, clung desperately to fascist explanations, insisting everything they witnessed was temporary or staged or somehow unrepresentative of real American conditions. Their denials grew increasingly strained as evidence accumulated beyond any reasonable dismissal. Others, like Maria Rossetti, experienced profound ideological transformation as the gap between propaganda and reality became impossible to ignore. They began questioning not just specific fascist claims about American weakness but the entire framework of authoritarian certainty that had shaped their worldviews since childhood. Corporal Elena Valenti articulated the psychological crisis in a letter to her mother that military censors flagged for its political implications but ultimately allowed to pass. She described feeling as if she had spent her entire life believing the sky was green, only to discover it had always been blue and everyone who told her otherwise had been systematically lying. The comparison captured the fundamental nature of the revelation. These women hadn't discovered minor factual errors or temporary conditions. They had encountered evidence that their entire political education, their understanding of economics, their beliefs about human nature and social organization, their faith in fascist ideology had been built on foundations of deliberate falsehood. The transformation accelerated as Japan's surrender in August 1945 ended the war and changed prisoner status from captured enemies to displaced persons awaiting repatriation. Camp restrictions relaxed. Prisoners gained more freedom to interact with local communities, visit nearby towns, and observe American civilian life without the constraints of wartime security. At Camp Reynolds, Rossetti volunteered for a work program that placed prisoners with local families needing domestic help or farm labor. She was assigned to the Patterson family, who owned a dairy farm outside Millville. Thomas and Helen Patterson had 2 teenage daughters and operated 160 acres that had been in their family since the 1870s. The 3 months Rossetti spent living with the Pattersons completed her ideological transformation through intimate exposure to American family life that propaganda had consistently misrepresented. The Pattersons were neither wealthy elites nor downtrodden workers. They occupied some middle category that fascist class analysis had insisted couldn't exist under capitalism. They owned their land outright, operated expensive machinery purchased through bank loans, made independent business decisions about milk production and cattle management, and maintained a standard of living that exceeded what Italian professionals enjoyed. Their daughters attended public school free of charge, aspired to college education that seemed routinely achievable, and spoke casually about futures filled with possibilities rather than predetermined by class or gender. Helen Patterson treated Rossetti as a guest rather than a servant, insisting she join family meals, attend church services if she wished, and participate in community activities without obligation. The casual equality was disorienting. Rossetti had been trained to see clear hierarchies, obvious power structures, and natural divisions between classes. The Patterson household operated through cooperation and mutual respect that defied those expectations. One evening in late September, Rossetti helped Helen can tomatoes from the family garden, a process that produced over 100 jars of preserved food for winter use. As they worked, Helen explained how farm families maintained food security through systematic preservation, crop rotation, and livestock management that had evolved over generations. The conversation revealed planning horizons that extended beyond immediate survival to long-term prosperity, multi-generational wealth building, and systematic improvement of land and facilities. The Pattersons thought in terms of decades, not just seasons. They made investments in soil quality, equipment upgrades, and infrastructure improvements that might only pay returns years later but would benefit their children and grandchildren. This long-term thinking, this confidence in stable futures, this assumption that individual effort would yield proportional rewards all stemmed from institutional frameworks that protected property rights, enforced contracts, and maintained political stability through democratic processes rather than authoritarian control. Rossetti realized she was witnessing the practical operation of principles she had been taught to despise. Individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and democratic accountability weren't abstract theories. They were daily realities that shaped how the Pattersons lived, worked, planned, and dreamed about futures they believed they could influence through their own choices and efforts. By the time repatriation orders arrived in December 1945, Rossetti had made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable 6 months earlier. She requested permission to remain in the United States, applying for displaced person status that would allow her to stay and eventually pursue citizenship. The camp administrator processing her request, a major named Catherine Hoffman, asked why she wanted to stay. Rossetti struggled to articulate the complete transformation of her understanding, eventually settling on simple honesty. She explained that everything she had believed about America had been proven false through direct experience. That she had discovered principles and possibilities she wanted to embrace rather than oppose. That she couldn't return to Italy and pretend she hadn't witnessed what freedom looked like in practice. Major Hoffman approved her request, connecting her with immigration assistance programs established for displaced Europeans. Rossetti became one of 473 Italian women prisoners who chose to remain in America rather than return to a homeland that suddenly felt foreign to the people they had become. The choice brought profound personal costs. Rossetti's family back in Florence initially refused communication, viewing her decision as betrayal of country and heritage. Her mother wrote bitter letters accusing her of abandoning family obligations for material comfort. Her younger sister called her a traitor who had forgotten Italian pride and dignity. The accusations stung because they contained partial truths. Rossetti had chosen material prosperity over nationalist loyalty. She had prioritized individual opportunity over family duty. She had rejected fascist principles for democratic values. But she couldn't honestly describe her choice as abandonment or betrayal because she no longer believed the alternatives her family defended represented valid paths to human flourishing. She had witnessed abundance, genuine freedom, and systematic respect for individual dignity. Having seen those possibilities, returning to systems that produced scarcity, authoritarian control, and predetermined hierarchies felt like choosing blindness after gaining sight. Other Italian prisoners made different choices based on different circumstances and convictions. Many returned to Italy, carrying memories and observations that would influence their perspectives on politics, economics, and international relations for decades. Some maintained fascist beliefs despite contradictory evidence, demonstrating ideology's capacity to survive direct refutation through psychological defenses that rationalized away uncomfortable truths. But significant numbers experienced transformations similar to Rossetti's, questioning and eventually abandoning political convictions that couldn't withstand contact with American reality. They returned to Italy as changed people, carrying knowledge about democratic prosperity that would influence their participation in post-war reconstruction and political development. Lieutenant Ricci returned to her family in Turin, where she became involved in Christian democratic politics that rejected both fascism and communism in favor of democratic governance and market economics. Her experiences observing American civilian life informed her advocacy for policies that protected individual rights, encouraged private enterprise, and limited state power. Sergeant Costa went back to administrative work in Naples, eventually rising to management positions in Italy's recovering commercial sector. She applied organizational principles learned through observing American voluntary associations, discovering that decentralized coordination often achieved better results than hierarchical control when participants shared common goals and clear communication. Corporal Mancini returned to agricultural economics, completing advanced studies that incorporated American farming methods she had observed during captivity. She became an advocate for mechanization, scientific farming, and private property rights that enabled individual farmers to benefit directly from productivity improvements. The statistical impact of Italian women prisoners' American exposure never received systematic documentation, but anecdotal evidence suggested significant influence on post-war Italian development. Women who had witnessed American abundance, organization, and prosperity often became effective advocates for democratic reforms and market economics in ways that male prisoners who hadn't experienced similar civilian integration did not. Their unique perspective, observing American society through domestic work, community interaction, and family integration rather than purely military contexts, provided insights into how democratic institutions functioned in daily practice rather than abstract theory. They had seen freedom's fruits in kitchens, churches, schools, and farms rather than just factories and military bases. By 1950, Rossetti had married an American veteran, purchased a small home in Pennsylvania, and begun working as a translator for immigration services helping other Italian displaced persons navigate American bureaucracy. Her transformation from fascist believer to democratic advocate was complete, though she carried scars from the psychological dislocation of abandoning certainties that had once defined her identity. She maintained that the 4th of July 1945 remained the single most significant day of her life because it marked the moment when accumulated propaganda collapsed under the weight of direct experience. The fireworks, the abundance, the genuine community celebration had revealed truths that years of fascist education had obscured. She had witnessed what freedom looked like in practice and discovered it bore no resemblance to the chaos and weakness propaganda had predicted. Her story, multiplied across hundreds of Italian women who experienced similar revelations, represented a quiet victory more complete than military conquest. These women hadn't been defeated by American weapons but converted by American principles demonstrated through daily example rather than imposed through force. They had come as prisoners of war. They left as witnesses to possibilities that would shape their lives and influence their societies for generations. The transformation occurred not through coercion or indoctrination but through simple exposure to abundance, organization, and genuine freedom that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. In the end, the most powerful weapons weren't bombs or bullets but community picnics, church gatherings, family farms, and 4th of July fireworks that revealed the productive capacity of democratic societies operating according to principles that respected individual dignity and protected human liberty. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.